All right. Welcome, everyone, to our latest in the DOE Energy Innovator Fellows webinar series. Today, we are here to talk about cost of service studies with Tony Georges. And it is May 20th, 2026. I am not Lisa Schwartz, and Lisa became a grandmother last night, and so is attending to some other duties today. And so I am here in her stead. My name is Jeff Deason. I am a colleague of Lisa's in the Energy Markets and Planning Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I actually presented on one of these webinars last fall. And I will be taking filling Lisa's shoes as the moderator for today. I'm going to give the floor in a moment to Tony Georges. He's a managing director and founding partner at New Strategies and Solutions. He has 25 plus years of expertise in utility strategy, financial analysis, planning and rate design, leads strategic planning, financial sustainability initiatives, and expert witness engagements, helping utilities improve performance and make informed decisions in complex regulatory environments. And so he's going to be talking today about cost of service studies, which I am excited to go into in some depth. We have a pretty small crowd today, but of course this webinar is being recorded, and so there will be for a wider viewing audience elsewhere. And so, but given that we have a pretty small crowd, we really encourage you, if you have questions or comments, to go ahead and raise your hands, or you can, if you prefer, you can enter questions or comments in the chat box, which I will sort of monitor while Tony is talking, and I may interrupt Tony just to stay closer to the material so we don't have to go backwards. But we can also take additional questions after Tony's presentation during Q&A. And if you raise your hand and are willing to speak, I will call on you to unmute yourself, or again, you can just use the comment feature if you prefer. A little bit of housekeeping on the series. So next month in June, we have a program on demand flexibility programs and rates and load management analytics. The three presenters are all well known to me, and so this will be a great session. My colleagues Sean Murphy and Elliot Crow at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Sean will talk in some detail about emerging demand flexibility programs and their features and how they work. Elliot is an expert in sort of the measurement and verification attached to demand flexibility programs, and that is used to help settle the results of those programs. And then in between, Cisco DeVries is currently at the Goldman School at UC Berkeley, and formerly was the CEO of Ohm Connect, which was a residential demand flexibility program provider. And so he'll have some really great insight from the practitioner perspective. And then in August, we have a session with my also close colleague, Natalie Mims-Frick at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory on evolving stakeholder engagement practices for regulatory proceedings with a focus on distribution system planning. There will also be some peer sharing breakouts during that webinar. And so you can register for those at the links here if you like. And then a couple of other series to be aware of if you work at a PUC or state energy office. We have a peer sharing webinar series on distribution system planning co-hosted with Naruk and Nazio. On June 22nd, we'll have a session on advanced building technologies. August 13th, stakeholder engagement requirements and practices. And then there's also the joint NERUC LBNL distributed energy projects interconnection cohort to advance interconnection solutions late in just a week. There's a webinar there on data transparency for interconnection timelines and costs, which is a really big topic these days. And so there's a whole bunch of links here that you can use to register for any of these sessions. And that is it. So with that, I will go ahead and give the floor to Tony, unless there are any questions up front. All right, Tony, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, if or as you have questions as we go through the content, since we have a smaller group today, please feel free to raise your hand, throw it in the chat, or speak up and interrupt me. I'd be happy to go into more context to some of the items we discussed today. Before I start sharing and walk through it, I'll just let you know this is We give we give quite a bit of rates and cost of service type of training across the country, and typically just the cost of service is like a 2-day effort. So just to understand, we're kind of skimming the surface and compressing this into a 40-45 minute presentation with some Q&A towards the end. So with that, I will start sharing and we'll walk through the presentation. All right, leg goes to presentation mode, and I'll move this over. All right. So I think the first thing we'll get started with, so from just a broad point of view, I'm not really sure of everyone's background on the phone, but the cost of service process overall is a very large accounting process, a regulatory economic accounting process. That's what we'll be focusing on today. Within that context, there are many different points of view in these processes in the development of a cost of service. So you have investor IOU at the top here is investor-owned utility. That's like a Dominion or an Xcel Energy or whoever it may be across the country, wherever you are from. These utilities operate for profit. They have a return on rate base. They're structured a little bit differently. You have municipal utilities, which are owned by the city. So similar to a water or wastewater utility in your community, oftentimes the municipal entity owns and operates an electric utility. Austin Energy in Texas or CPS, it's also in Texas. You have several in California, the entire state of Nebraska. So there are many of these across the country. And then thirdly is a cooperative. There are two types of cooperative, a G&T or generation transmission, or the delivery cooperative or the member co-op that actually delivers the electricity to the end user. These are scattered throughout the country. Typically, the foundation of these were in rural communities, extending long distances to reach, farming, ranching communities, things like that. The way these are structured is very different. So there are different perspectives and different regulatory regimes or jurisdictions that manage these utilities, and at times they regulate monopoly in the IOU space. So understanding that can lead to different decisions and or impacts on the cost service process. So you can read many of these for yourself, but I think one of the biggest ones is retail rate regulation. So I think more broadly across the country, a lot of us hear about electric utilities and think about their state utility commission and or the FERC. In the case of investor-owned utilities, they are managed and regulated, not managed, but regulated by the state across the country, depending on the region of the country. There's a whole bunch of other elements that come into play there. Whether there's a power market and a transmission market, those have huge impacts into the operations and the regulatory impacts of that investor-owned utility and the municipal, for that matter, and co-op. You can see the financial objectives, taxes, those things. Taxes vary between the type of entity, which would then impact the cost to serve. Financing and the profit motives there and structures and interest on debt are handled differently across all three types of utilities, and we'll get into that. Subject to competition, yes, and varying degrees across the country. Texas probably is highlighted as the biggest retail competition state in the country. However, there are other elements as far as how customers can compete for different products and services for utility. In California, there are community choice aggregators that offer an alternative on power supply side. The wires are still fully regulated locally, similar to Texas, but instead of getting an individual having a choice, it's an overall community that gets a choice. Business objectives, generations. One of the things I think I would highlight here, a cost of service process for an investor-owned utility, very different as far as the regulatory process that it goes through to get a rate case, quote unquote, rate case approved, is very different than municipal and a co-op due to that regulatory structure in a state. These IOUs are typically much, much larger than municipals. And many co-ops, but some of the G&T co-ops are quite large as well that operate in large regions of the United States and across multiple states. Typically, when you hear about big generation investments and things like that, capacity, those are typically done in the investor-owned space. There are municipals that have and own operate generation, but not near to the magnitude that the IOUs do. Similar to cooperatives, although the G&Ts have more economies of scale in that regard. Rate complexity. So eventually, as you complete the cost service and eventually translates into rates, an IOU's rates and I guess let's say the catalog of rates that are available for an investor-owned utility is, 2 to 3 to 4 times more dense than a municipal or cooperative. Typically in the municipal and cooperative space, those rates are much more simplistic in nature. So fewer customer classes, maybe fewer rate options, but that is changing across the country. But in general, IOUs just more broadly are more complex. They're much larger, have much more detail, and many more eyeballs on their rate cases than the municipal and cooperatives do. So what we're going to walk through today is the overall cost service process. This illustrates the overall rate design process, and we'll go into some other steps as well. But in general, these 5 steps are what utilities walk through to develop cost service and eventually transition to rate design that the customers would see on their bill. You determine the revenue requirement, which is step 1. We'll go into that in more detail. Steps 2, 3, and 4 are really the bulk and meat of a cost of service process and cost allocation. So those steps are unbundling. So in a utility, they offer multiple functional operational areas. They have generation, transmission, distribution, and customer related functions. Costs are broken down into those components. Unbundling is really critically important, especially in areas of the country where there are markets. So where you have competition on power supply and transmission markets, those pieces can be handled in the marketplace that then are translated into a utilities or load serving entities cost of service. Steps 3 and 4 are much more prescriptive and specific. So we'll classify the cost. The step 3 is really where things translate into fixed versus variable cost, and we'll get into that. Not a lot of people maybe think of their electric utility as heavily fixed cost dominated. If you're not in the business, people think if I use less electricity, similar in water side, if you use less water, my bill should go down dramatically. That's not really how the costs are based in operating a utility, and we'll go into that. Once you've classified those costs, they're then allocated to the customer classes. Step 4 is really where you start to see differentiation in the cost to serve the different classes. It's also where you start to dive into a lot more of the regulatory intervention and things like that with regards to these rate cases at an IOU level. Once that is complete, you translate that cost by class into rates. And steps 4 and 5 are not typically perfectly aligned, although the goal is to align step 5 with the results of the cost service. And we'll touch on that at the very end, but just at a high level. So a revenue requirement, you can think of the revenue requirement as the total cost to serve all customers in the electric utility. So no matter who the utility is serving, they come up with their revenue requirement, which has its discrete pieces. It's the total cost to provide electricity capacity services to all of those customers at varying different types. The real key, once you've developed the revenue requirement, this is another component where there's an enormous amount of intervention. So these are the total costs. So when a utility comes up with a rate case or submits a rate case, whether it's a municipal, a co-op, or whoever, these total costs are typically that first step in the process and identify really how much overall the rates would need to go up or down to recover the total cost. So this is the first glimpse that we get into rates going up or rates going down or rates stable, that sort of thing, in addition to understanding which pieces are fully in control of the utility and which pieces are not. Again, the role of markets, fuel purchases, and variable costs that come into play. So looking at the revenue requirements, for those of you that have maybe a managerial accounting background or look at operating statements or income statements, it's very, very similar to these at a high level. So it includes the overall reasonable operating expenses. For an IOU, it includes depreciation. For municipals, it does not. You include a fair return on the investment, and then there's other revenue sources and other expenses. So just like you would see in any company, you have some other revenue streams or some other expenses. Those things get netted and either increase or reduce the total revenue requirement. Below here are bulleted the 3, again, at a very summary level, the 3 revenue requirements if you want to look at the math. So for an investor-owned utility, the total costs are equal to the operating expenses plus any taxes. Those are state, federal, labor taxes, things like that, plus depreciation expenses, annual depreciation expense, plus the return on the rate base. That's the RRB. So that's where there's another large amount of litigation in the overall rate proceedings. What sort of return on equity, then eventually a total rate of return would a utility receive on their investments in capital and their investments in plant. The real critical piece here in rate being rate base. So an investor-owned utility is incentivized to deploy capital. They're incentivized to invest and build because as they build and build infrastructure, they receive a return on that investment and a return on that deployment of capital. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of discussion around, are these investments prudent? Should they be invested in? What amount, is prudent and are reasonable for the utility to recover? And then that total net plant, essentially, overly simplified, but essentially net plant, is multiplied by the rate of return the utility would receive. Typically, that rate of return is anywhere between 8 to 10%. Those things fluctuate over time. Typically, the ROE is what's heavily argued in addition to the mix of debt to equity financing for the capital. For a municipal utility, the revenue requirement is similar, but this is where the biggest differences are between investor-owned and municipal. So an investor-owned utility is operating for profit. A municipal is not. A municipal utility's needs are cash-based, and they're less incentivized to deploy capital and more incentivized to manage, and they must manage their cash plus their revenue or their the debt that they issue, the bonds that they issue, have covenants included in them, which maintains very specific and discrete cash requirements for the utility. So in this case, the revenue requirement is equal to similarly the operating expenses. PILT is called payment in lieu of tax. So these are taxes that are that would be a franchise fee that the city would recover typically. Like for an investor-owned utility, they're paying franchise fee, right-of-way fees, other types of taxes. So if the municipal is operating that utility in lieu of that franchise fee revenue, there would be an equivalent type of a transfer or payment in lieu of tax to the city. That's an example of the PILT. In addition to that, you would have the cash funded capital expenses. So rather than a return on rate base, you're looking at how much cash is being used to fund capital plus their annual debt service. And that would be the principal and interest on that debt service. For a co-op, somewhat similar to an IOU, but in this case, similarly, OpEx. You do include the interest on their debt, interest and debt, so the principal and interest plus the margin on the interest, which is called TIER, which is not TIER, but times interest earned. It should be TIER, sorry, times interest earned ratio, which is typically like a 1.1, something like that, on the interest expense that they're incurring. So they need to maintain a margin. Similarly, for munis, there's a debt service coverage ratio, which includes and requires a margin for the bonds to remain solvent or the utility to remain solvent to pay the bonds. These are the components. We've talked a little bit about these already. Depending on the type of utility, some of these move in or out. Instead of depreciation and cost of capital for a muni, it would be simply the cash expenditures for capital. And you can read the rest for your own information. This is a slide that summarizes and would be a good reference slide depending on what your lens is on this interest area and cost service. But this just highlights some of the differences in comparing the different revenue requirements by utility type. You can see the IOU, the cooperatives, and the munis, and you can see which pieces come in and out. Again, the big pieces is really how debt, whether it's principal and interest or debt service, is treated versus in an IOU versus a co-op versus a muni. As you move left to right, that debt starts to creep in much more and be a bigger part of that revenue requirement, whereas return and taxes start to drop off depending on the type of utility. I think overall, what I would say is there's typically a margin in all of these utilities. They must maintain a margin in their operating costs. They can't just operate, just the cost equal our rates. There always has to be a margin, whether it be for working capital, a margin that's required just for volatility in the market, and cash reserves, or a margin that's required by the bond covenants that are imposed upon the co-op or the muni as well. So moving from the revenue requirement, which is our total cost, translating that into the way I would think about this is we're breaking apart a total cost. Let's say we have $100 million. We're now going to break it into multiple pieces that look eventually kind of like a matrix. And then we take that matrix and we allocate it to these customer classes to rebuild and ensure we recover the total cost identified in step one. So we'll walk through each of these, but you'll hear me use words in here, unbundle or functionalize. They're used interchangeably. Those are very common words in the industry. Classifying costs, again, this is where we identify fixed versus variable costs. Classification of costs boils down to identifying demand-related costs, which are capacity or a fixed cost. So what is the annual peak of a customer, and what are the peaks we need to serve to meet those customers' needs? Whether that's, we need to understand what that peak is at a system level. We need to understand that peak locally. That impacts the size of generating plant we build. That impacts the transmission plant and wires and conductors and substations we build. And then locally, the distribution system and the type of wire we connect to the customer. All those pieces are fixed infrastructure cost items, all determined by the peak demands placed on the system by the customer, the class, or the overall system. Energy related costs, which is probably the most familiar. These are going to be kilowatt hour or variable related costs that we identify primarily in the production/generation component. Very rarely are there other variable costs throughout the system. And then customer related costs. These are going to be things like a customer service dropper connection, or a meter, or customer service, or customer billing. Those are quote unquote customer costs. Once we have demand, energy, and customer, we then allocate each of those to the customer classes based upon their impact to demand, their impact to energy, and their impact on the customer service component. Once that is completed and we have a cost of service by class, once we have that $100 million divided into, okay, $50 million needs to be is the cost to serve residential, 20 million is small commercial, 20 million is medium commercial, and 10 million is large commercial. That would then influence and then translate into the overall rate design to make sure that you're designing rates to collect $100 million, and hopefully designing rates to collect the same amount of the cost of service for residential, small commercial, and so on. However, as some of you likely know, that's rarely the case. And so we get into other issues which hopefully you've had a context or some understanding for. This is a simplified illustration and diagram of the overall electric utility system. You can see item A here being the generation plant. One other thing I would really call out here is, as our overall electric system in the country has evolved, different pieces of this, electric utility generation system have been broken apart to become competitive, moved into markets. Some are still vertically integrated. I'm here in Colorado. We just now expanded into Markets West for SPP, but a chunk of Colorado is still vertically integrated with the IOU. Similarly, in places like Arizona, Wyoming, going out to California, vertically integrated utilities similar to the southeastern part of the United States. They're still vertically integrated utilities, provide all of these services to their customers. In other parts of the country with markets, these pieces, the transmission, the generation, are separated from the load serving entity or the local utility that you likely know if you're in those markets. You can see the transmission system, high voltage, 115 kV down to 69 kV, and even very high voltage transmission lines, the big towers that we're used to seeing. Eventually, that step down locally in our communities and our cities to the distribution system, and eventually getting to our end use customers. If we look at overall functions of the utility, these are descriptions just of each of those functions. Generation system is responsible for providing demand, producing energy for our end use by the customers. Transmission, taking the energy and power generated at the generator, which is far away from where your home or your business is, and transmitting that into the local community. Once we get into the community, we then step it down to distribution system and distribution voltage, all fixed cost related, bringing that power and energy right to your home or business. And then the customer piece, customer service, customer connections, billing, things like that, that you're more familiar with in dealing with the utility. So I wanted to get into in our 2-day session and training on cost of service, there's an enormous amount of investment time on looking at developing allocators and direct assignment. So when we develop a revenue requirement and the total costs, at that point in time, let's say it's $100 million, we then have to identify how much of the $100 million is associated with generation, transmission, distribution, and customer. That's the very first step, is functionalization or unbundling. So we go into a much deeper dive in very specific direct assignment or allocation factors that are developed to unbundle that total $100 million. And then subsequently in classification, We have additional direct assignment and allocation factors that we identify. And then finally, in customer allocations, similarly, we have direct assignments and allocation factors. So throughout this process, the development of these direct assignments and primarily these derived allocators are critically important. And this is where we get into a lot of the issues in any rate case. So that's where an expert witness like myself has paid money to get in and tear apart a rate case to identify where we agree or disagree with total costs and how things are allocated. So if you're hopefully familiar with FERC accounting, it's a very straightforward accounting system that identifies costs into very discrete accounts, expense accounts and plant accounts. Once they're put into those specific accounts, we then know typically how to treat them if we agree to what the costs are. So typically in a FERC account, like FERC account 582, plant account, station or operating expense, station expense, we would understand that this is a distribution related expense. So if there's $1 million identified in FERC account 582, we would just say that $1 million is directly assigned to the distribution system. It's not affecting any other part of the system. That's where those costs lie. Thus, if a customer was only using the transmission system and didn't use the distribution system, this portion of the revenue requirement would not be applicable to them and or allocated to them at the end of the day. So this is that first step in the process. It's easy. We have FERC accounts for production, for transmission, distribution, and A&G. Obviously, as you would expect, production, transmission, distribution accounts can be directly assigned to each of those functions. Having said that, once we get into A&G and overhead types of accounts and expenses, we can't say these are directly assigned to the production system, generations, or transmission and distribution systems. We have to identify some way to allocate those total costs to each of those functions. Similarly, once we get into classification and customer, we do similar processes to allocate these costs once identified in the function and the classification to the customer. In this case, if we looked at a 9 point here at this row, what is that? The fifth row here, the total $9.5 million of total overhead costs or A&G, administrative and general related costs. We need to find a way to allocate that 9.5 million to each of the four functions. So if we look at this and we broke down, we would go in and investigate out of the $9.5 million, we would do a cost-based accounting exercise to identify, okay, how much of the labor cost is in production, how much is in transmission, distribution, and overall. So we look at each of these functions, and we have 9.5 million that's associated with total labor costs in each of the functions. So this isn't with the A&G, but just within the functions. We have 3 million in labor in our utility. We have $1 million in labor for transmission linemen. We have 5 million for distribution linemen, and we have $500,000 for our key accounts folks. So that's where we get the total 9.5 million in the very direct labor associated with operating the utility. So as we look at that, we can say 3 million, 1 million, 5, $500,000 in each of these functions. We can see that 32% is then translated into production, 11% transmission, 52% distribution, 5% customer. So you can see here the labor costs of this utility heavily weighted in production and distribution. So likely to have a significant amount of generation. And as you would expect, a large majority of their costs are in the distribution system, which is not uncommon. So this is how the labor breaks down. So we've identified this overall labor cost just to operate the utility. We can then use this percentage to then apply to some of our A&G accounts. So if we have a FERC account 920, which is administrative and general salaries, we can say that those salaries or the time spent in managing the overall utility is going to be directly related to the time managing the actual staff and the labor. So we use that percentage breakdown to then allocate $1 million of A&G salaries. These are not the salaries within each function or to operate the utility at the distribution transmission level. These are the salaries that are like management salaries, the CEO, things like that. So we have $1 million. We would then use that breakdown of labor that we use to allocate that $1 million to each of these four functions. So you can see here how that translates this $1 million into following that labor cost wherever it is within the function. That's how these derived allocators are critical in moving dollars around within the system and eventually within the customers. So that walks us through the full functionalization process. Once we get into each function, whether it's these four: production, transmission, distribution, and customer, from there, just within production, we then split the cost between demand and energy related. Similarly, in transmission, these are demand almost fully demand related unless you're in California. Then there's some direct assignments potentially in transmission systems. In the distribution systems, these are all fixed costs. There are no variable costs in operating a distribution system. It's all demand related and customer related. And then finally, customer service, which is all customer related. As you can see here, there is only one function which has a variable piece or the energy related piece, and that's within production. Those costs are typically going to be the purchase of fuel, whether it's coal, natural gas, whatever it may be, to operate and that you would consume to generate energy. Oftentimes with power purchase agreements, things like a wind contract or a solar contract, those are typically megawatt hour based. So those would vary with energy. Sometimes those are energy related. There is some variable O&M as well, but typically fuel is the dominant energy related cost in any utility revenue requirement. The rest is all fixed. So building on that fixed variable discussion, once we get each function classified costs as demand, energy, and customer related into these buckets on the right side of this table, we can then collapse all that and in theory take our $100 million revenue requirement that we talked about earlier, and we can say X amount is demand related, X amount is customer related, or Y amount is customer related, and Z amount is energy related. Once we've done that, we can come to these pie charts here on the right and understand how much of the revenue requirement overall cost is fixed and variable related, and we can also reference that against how much of the rate revenue is fixed and variable related. This misalignment is extremely common, is a standard across the country. In about every state, with the exception of Texas and a little bit of California, given the energy component in California. Texas is energy based, not capacity based. That's why there's such a strong energy component. The rest of the country would have this misalignment for the most part. So looking at the costs that are fixed or variable, fixed costs vary with capacity additions. So they vary with the amount of infrequent demands that are placed upon the system. So if you think about the entire year, think about like Arizona or Texas or Florida, somewhere it gets really hot. They would set their peak in the summertime, sometime between June and September. And so that peak demand that is placed on the system, the utility has to build has expenses to serve that peak demand in the summertime. Similarly, maybe in a winter peaking system in the far north part of the United States that's more dependent on heating, maybe a little bit more electric heating on the system. It may have a peak in the winter, so it has to build infrastructure to meet that winter peak. Whatever it may be for that utility, those costs are all fixed for that utility to provide service. The variable costs are simply variable with the energy, like we talked about, primarily fuel consumption over time over the course of the year. Those variable costs and energy consumed are not a unique 1 hour or 15 minutes in one part of the year. It would be throughout the year we're incurring those costs. These pie charts on the right are somewhat reflective or representative, I would say, of this misalignment of in a revenue requirement. You will typically see anywhere between 50 to 75% of the cost to operate a utility being fixed. Typically 25, 35% are variable or fuel related, energy related, or potentially variable O&M. On the right here, this is strictly just due to the rate making that takes place primarily in the residential space across the country. Our residential rates do not include demand or bigger fixed charge components. Thus, our revenues for a utility are typically dominated by the variable piece, not the fixed. So you can see here where we run into some problems as we have, maybe an explosion of, variable costs coming onto the utility with a very hot summer. The energy costs are trying to recover fixed costs, and they may not be aligned, so we may over or under recover our costs. That's why utilities are always essentially chasing their tail and using true ups or cost adjustments to make ends meet between this fixed and variable misalignment. This is a good graphic to reference is looking at each of the steps in the process. You can see the revenue requirement here on the left. We functionalize in step two into the production through customer piece. We classify these costs. Once steps 1 through 3 are completed, we'll then move into allocating costs to those customer classes. This is the most contentious part, I would say. Once you've developed the overall revenue requirement, now you are allocating the costs based upon each customer class's impact on the system. And so this is where you get varying rates depending on the customer class you're in. Customer or commercial class rates are low, residential rates are high. That's where you get this give and play. But on a cost basis system, we're simply just allocating it based upon costs imposed on the system. We'll look at each function and the classified cost within each function. So within production, we have demand costs. Those production demand costs are allocated to each of the customer classes based upon their impact on the production system. In the distribution system, similarly, the distribution demand costs are allocated to the customer classes based upon their impact on demand locally on the distribution system. We derive these allocations from essentially load research data and or advanced metering infrastructure. So AMI/smart meters, which are metering customers every 15 minutes or 1 hour, depending upon the customer class. We get very, very exacting information on how customer classes are impacting and using the system. We also look at load forecasts. So what is the load forecasted to do in the future? There's a whole piece of this we are not getting into at all called known and measurable adjustments. Those things happen in the cost side in addition to the customer consumption side. So for example, if there's a large change coming to the system, a very large industrial customer coming or leaving the system, we would make adjustments in the numbers, whether it's costs or the consumption data. We would make adjustments on both sides and call that a known and measurable adjustment. We'll look at weather impacts. You will hear things like the weather normalization of the data to make sure we aren't taking a very unique or abnormal weather event that is impacting the allocations to the classes. We would want to quote unquote normalize it to a steady state or a typical or expected impact on the system. Demand allocations, this next to last bullet here. This is essentially where everyone in a rate case would dive into if you're pitting customer class against customer class. So depending on your point of view, if you're commercial or residential, you're going to have very different views on what the allocation should be on demand. That's the only reason there are differentiations in the rates, is the allocations of those demand costs and the fixed costs. When looking at serving customers, there are, just as you're looking at a fast food joint or going to the store for clothes or whatever it may be, there are different services that are offered by the electric utility. You can have firm service. You can have non-firm service, which means we're not required as a utility to always provide you power. If there's not enough power in the system, we cut you off. There's other ancillary services. Are you base load, load following, peaking? Are those types of production services broken out within this utility? What are cash reserve needs? Are there seasonal elements to your operations and or the utility that they need to consider? Are you in or out of a market in a part of the country? So looking at these different service offerings is critical in evaluating how you would allocate costs to the system. In addition to that, as I mentioned, known and measurable adjustments are an enormous part of this process. So we're in this day and age, especially given the proliferation of large loads and data centers on the in the news and everywhere else, utilities are being combated with how do they serve these large loads, which in many cases are equal to the entire load on the system already. So certainly for many co-ops and municipal utilities, a single data center coming to the table would be equal to their peak load, if not exceeding it by a factor of 2. So how that impacts their operations, the types of services they can offer that customer will impact how the costs are allocated. So looking at the delivery system, this is really critical, looking at the transmission costs and the distribution costs. It's critical from a customer standpoint. For example, the easiest example is think of like a convenience store connected to the distribution system. They're typically going to be connected on the secondary voltage system. So that's very similar. That's the same connection that you would receive at your home. You're getting, 120 volt service and your plugs, things like, or get 480 volt service and service drop to your house. Translate that, to local energy you use in a convenience store and in your home. That's a secondary level service. If you're on the transmission level side, like a large industrial customer, let's say, a steel plant, something like that, they are connected at a much higher voltage at 69 kV, 115 kilovolts. So they're connected typically directly to the transmission system and or the market in the state if it's in a market. As they're connected to the transmission system, they should not be allocated any costs associated with the distribution system. And if you're connected high enough in the transmission system, I would argue you should be allocated any of the costs that are lower voltage in the transmission system. So those are issues that come up in cost of service studies when we hear them at the state utility commissions. There's other elements, access to a market, are you a standard billing or a custom billing type of situation? Distributed generation considerations are an enormous impact. Combined heat and power at some of these industrial locations or rooftop solar, any sort of local distributed generation can impact the type of offering that a customer receives and the cost they impose on the system. So depending on the services you receive, you should tailor the rates to it and the costs. So looking at our classes, customer classes, we need to look at what different load characteristics do you have, service voltages, what we talked about, and that would impact the cost to serve those different customer classes. So we need to split them out into different types of customers. These are the typical customer classes that you would see in any rate or in any utility or any rate study: residential, small, commercial, industrial, so on and so forth. We now typically see electric vehicle. Lighting is always on its own. We typically now see electric vehicle or distributed generation or net metering rates as well. Those can be split out separately depending on the costs imposed on the system. We talked about this a little bit with some of the EVs and distributed generation within residential. There are further classes within the classes that are always brought up. Typically, there's low-income discounts that are looked at. Load management or time of use type of efforts. Time of use, TOU, is a rate-making mechanism to incentivize customers to shift off peak. Commercial and industrial, there's again similar things on load management. Are we going to interrupt or curtail the customer? That may lead to different types of customers just within that class. To eventually develop the allocations to the customer classes, we need load research data. As I mentioned, the AMI data in today's day and age that's been around for 15 years gives very specific, discrete information, extremely defensible and transparent to show how we allocate costs to customers. This has really eliminated a lot of the, guesswork or proxy use in any sort of rate case or cost allocation. So we'll look at what we call coincident demand. That's the total system peak, and I'll show you a graphic of that. That's the system peak on a monthly basis for the utility. So what's the monthly peak in July versus January? Non-coincident peak is the distribution system, and then on-peak, off-peak kilowatt hours. And then customer class load factor is another element I'm not going to get into, but that's another key criteria or element that we look at in why costs are allocated differently across customer classes. This is a great representation of looking at what these non-coincident peaks and coincident peaks look like. So this is, let's say Acme Utility and their 12 months of system peak. So you can see this top line here starting at about 800 megawatts, peaking to their system peak or annual peak here in August of 1,000 megawatts, and then dropping back down for the non-summer months. So this is a summer peaking system, let's say in Texas, for example, or Oklahoma or in Mexico. They get their peak in the summer. So we would allocate the coincident peak cost based upon that one CP in the system that happened in August. Now, that's typically not the allocation used, and we'll get into that. But the NCP would be each individual class's peak if they were their own system. So when does that peak occur? Regardless of the system peak. That's a non-coincident peak. If you look at the once you start looking at diversity in the system, you will see how these relate, the relationships between what we call a sum of max demands, which is summing all the individual customers' maximum demand regardless of the time on the system. So every single residential, commercial, industrial customers' peak demand throughout the year, no matter when. That's the absolute largest number you would have. With the diversity, once you look at a localized or a customer class peak, that then decreases from the sum of max demands to the NCP or the class NCPs. It's going to be less than the sum of max demands. And as you go to the system peak level, that diversity again across all of the different customer classes, looking at the system, what's each customer class's contribution to the system peak? That's the final step and the smallest number there on the right. So looking at the allocation methods that we have, the demand allocation methods, this is again really where we spend the time, and a lot of the testimony and cross-examination happens within a rate case in addition to the revenue requirement. The generation and transmission system is typically sized. I'm not familiar with too many that are sized on anything other than some element of a coincident peak or an excess peak. So a CP is typically used to allocate generation and transmission costs. Now that can be a one NCP, which I am not aware of any of those across the country. Typically, you're looking at a 4-month summer peak, so a 4 CP system, or maybe a 12 CP system that has more stability and less seasonal volatility in their monthly peaks. So you'd allocate costs based upon those monthly coincident peak contributions. There are hybrid methods. So again, there's probably 8 to 10 different variations of some sort of generation and transmission demand allocator, but they're typically based in a peaking component and some sort of average demand or average energy component, just depending on the jurisdiction. If you use one of these hybrid methods, it's a mix of the CP and some sort of energy or average demand. The distribution system, if you recall that diversity graph I showed you, we're looking at the more local or class peaks, regardless of when the system peaks, but what is the class peak for residential and commercial? Similarly, we would use a 1, 4, or a 12 NCP. Most of the IOUs use a 1 NCP. So the argument there is that the investor-owned utility is designing the distribution system for the single 1 hour peak of that class, regardless of when it happens. As you might expect, that 1 NCP will move around a lot throughout the year, just depending on the utility and the weather. In the municipal and co-op space, we typically see things allocated on a 4 or a 12 NCP to allow for some diversity and movement of that peak. And then the sum of max demands, which is more local for customer related components on the system. So things like a transformer or the secondary system. So I'm going to walk you through here rather quickly, walking through how these different selections of a peak matter. So these are the monthly coincident peaks for different customer classes, class A, B, and C. So you can see here, this is the months on the left, each class on the right, and their contributions to the system peak, which is totaled on the far right. At the bottom here, you will see the non-coincident peak for each customer class. So for class A, its individual maximum was 480, which was outside, and you'll notice above any of the system peaks in the column for Class A. Similarly, the 310 for Class B and so on. And you can see that number being 1,075 megawatts or kilowatts. That's well above the system peak of 1,000. Again, that's the diversity element. And then you can see the energy, and we've got our demand related costs that we're going to allocate. So if we look at each of these customer classes and we identified the 1 CP, 4 CP, 12 CP, and 1 NCP and an average and excess demand, that's the AED. So if we look at these different methods, we will come up with varying levels of percentages contributions to these costs. So the thing that I would draw your attention to is this range at the bottom. So for Class A, depending upon the allocation methods you select for demand, the amount of money that would go to Class A would be anywhere between 41.8% and 47.6%. So as you might imagine, depending on your perspective, you might argue for one allocation method over the other. And you can see the similar numbers for the other classes here. Again, just wanting to highlight, depending on the method you select, there are going to be quote unquote winners and losers. Thus, the need for rate case and how we have these expert witnesses arguing against one another or against the utility about how costs should be allocated. So before I get into the final steps in the process here in the rate design, I know we've got about 10 minutes here. I just want to check for some questions if there are any. And I want to note here in regards to allocation methods, what conventionally happens in this process is, or to be aware of, typically residential customers are not necessarily pitted against, but residential small commercial customers are typically grouped together and operate similarly versus commercial and industrial customers. Commercial and industrial customers will typically argue for more discrete allocations, so like a 4 CP or a 1 NCP, versus many more months. Typically, the more months you include in the allocation, the more you spread costs, the more it benefits residential and small commercial customers. The fewer months you include, the more it benefits commercial industrial customers and would shift more cost to residential. That's typically where these disagreements lie in how the utility allocates costs and how the customer classes would look at how they would prefer them to be allocated or how they would justify those to be allocated. So the last few slides here, I don't know if did anybody have any questions before we kind of translate from cost of service into rates?
I see that Anna has come off camera. I don't know if you have a question, Anna. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I now that you're saying this, I might be answered in the next section, but I was gonna ask about in regards to large load tariffs, why when you have cost allocation and the functionalization classification allocation, how that is different than like because that to me insulates customers from these large load tariffs that a lot of people are freaking out about, and how that's different from a tariff, which insulates customers. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Good question. Yeah, I'm not really, I'll highlight it a little bit. It goes into other elements. You need to understand what's called embedded costs versus marginal costs. So embedded costs are average costs that the utilities incurred to serve all their existing customers. Think of it that way.
Mhm.
Those are quote unquote average. Marginal costs are going to be marginal new costs that they incur to serve a large load or a data center. So what is happening in the functions in production and transmission? So data centers connect at the transmission system, typically 115 kV or higher, some at 69 kV. But they're going to increase costs related to production and transmission. So what utilities are doing across the country, and it's become a standard, is essentially creating contracts or separating the cost to serve a data center versus serving their existing customer base. Because as I mentioned, in that one example of like a municipal or a co-op, data centers are anywhere from 500 megawatts to 2 to 10 gigawatts. I mean, these are such large loads, not only from electric standpoint, from a water standpoint too, is depending on their HVAC technology. It's adding a city or two cities to a system. So no utility has ever really added another city to the system all at once. So they're approaching it by looking at the marginal cost to serve that customer, quantify that marginal cost, package it into what's called an ESA or a contract, an energy service agreement, and that would be assigned to that large load customer in the contract. And there's terms on those contracts anywhere from 12 to 20 years. But that's a whole nother, half day long discussion to itself. So that's the very high level discussion. But in the cost of service element and process, what utilities do, and this is actually happening in an APS case in Arizona right now. They are looking at wherever growth is driven on the system, they're packaging up and separating those costs from the rest of the system so that they can treat it differently. So just think of it as putting those costs in a different bucket so they can handle it and treat it differently with the customer classes. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, quantifying those marginal costs is a whole nother issue. So
Yes.
that's an issue to itself.
But you're saying the tariff is, yeah, I understand the difference that you're saying the tariff is just those, what is,
Yeah, there's typically
given those
not,
base costs,
yeah.
what is the cost of adding an incrementally more to the system, and
And it
that's the
would be
tariff.
customer by customer or data center by
Okay.
data center. So it's getting rarer and rarer. I mean, you'll probably see a tariff that is for large loads, but it's not going to have, it's rare and rarer that it has very specific rates. Like here's your customer charge, demand, and energy charge because there's not enough capacity on the system to serve them with their existing fleet. So what's happening is they'll develop a tariff, but each customer will have their own rates within that tariff in a contract. So it's not like, the tariff will have terms and conditions. I would frame it that way of providing service, but you're not going to see, oh, I'm going to have $1,000 customer charge and I'm going to pay $12 a kW and 5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's rare and rare that you would see that. Those are going to be determined based upon within the contract.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Okay. I'll move on to translating. So I'm not going to go into depth in the rate design process, but I just want to highlight how the cost service is used. These are just broader elements around rate making and utilities objectives around rate making. At the end of the day, if our costs are $100 million, we need rates that recover $100 million, at least, within a certain time frame. So these are considerations you need to understand in the eventual rate making process. We translate from an accounting process and cost of service to blending policy and other elements and pricing incentives in the rate making process. So they're two different processes that get overlapped, but the pure cost basis is what I wanted to kind of highlight. These are some competing objectives. You have competing objectives in a cost of service. In the accounting process, you're going to have competing objectives in making rates. We need to identify low-income customers and need to, allow them to have some ability to control the amount of energy that they're consuming, or fixed income people. There's legislative mandates. We have our renewable portfolio standards we must meet. We have very complex rates that represent the impacts on the system, but nobody who has a home understands very complex rates with 35 pieces to it. They can't really act and manage to that. So there's a lot of these competing objectives and policies that we need to take into account when translating from a cost to a rate. This is just one. I just wanted to really quickly highlight how much things have changed on the system and how customers' load profiles can impact costs and impact rate making. So on the right here, you can look at, this is a residential EV charging load profile. So this is just a normal residential customer. They come home in the afternoon. If there's no pricing signal, come home, you plug in your EV, boom, your peak just increased from the red line to the green line. Now take a step to the right. Now this customer not only has an EV, but they also have rooftop solar. So we've got this dip during the day, which some of you may be familiar with, that duck curve look in California. So we got this dip during the day where we generate power, come home, and now our peak's getting higher with our EV being charged in than the normal load. Now on the right, now we've implemented batteries at home. And so we can dispatch that battery to save all that power we generate, then dispatch it as we would have the car being plugged in. So we now reduce our peak. So there's a lot of chaos and change happening on the consumption side that we need to consider in pricing signals. We need to consider in the impact to our cost of service and impacting into the changing evolution of rates. This is a representation of subsidization. So this is always inherent in any utilities rates. The blue bar represents the cost to serve the customer class. The green bar represents what their rates recover. These are never perfectly aligned. The utilities are always working to align them. Typically, the residential customer classes are subsidized by commercial classes. That's somewhat true of small commercial at times too. It just kind of depends. But typically, the larger customers are impacting the system less, but their rates are slightly higher to mitigate rate impacts on residential. The utilities are always working towards parity here on these, but it takes time. It takes years to get there. These are just some rate design options as we start to wrap up here. On the left side of this graph, I just want to put the most simplistic type of rate. It's just we have a customer charge and an energy charge. We're done. That's not very complex. We understand that. On the right side is the most complex type of a pricing signal, which is real-time pricing, which would vary with every single hour in the year potentially. That best reflects system costs, but none of us are going to be able to manage our daily routine on 8,760 hours. So it's just to understand that we understand the cost, but how we translate the cost into pricing signals will further impact how people use the system and be efficient. Wanted to drop down the chat here if I could. See if there's anything else popping up. This is getting into some of that large load discussion in data centers. This has a much broader context as far as what I would categorize as growth pays for growth, or does the utility incentivize growth? This has been around forever, well before data centers, but Utilities can incentivize growth by paying for these line extensions, paying for these substations to bring the customer on board with the theory that a big customer, a rising tide floats all boats, right? So it'll help everybody. So what has changed is, for the most part across the country, most utilities, if not all, the customer that's coming to the system has to pay that line extension fee, or a new subdivision has to pay a line extension fee. It doesn't really matter what the customer is, but the growth is paid for directly by that individual customer, so it's not imposed on the rest of the system. That's for the infrastructure piece. So that's for like a substation, the transmission line, the connection. Power supply is a very different story, as we just spoke about. How do we procure the power to meet the needs of the data center or large load? Is that coming from a market? Are we building a power plant? Are we going out for a power purchase agreement for 15 years, 10 years, and then assigning it to the customer? Does this customer have on-site generation, a combined heat and power plant? Is it a campus, like utilities often have, or a college usually has, or even a steel plant for that matter? How does that integrate in these power supply agreements? Given the size of any large load, there's enormous risk related to the timing of the payments for the utility. Typically, the utility for an interconnection study, that maybe takes 3 months. So that payment is typically taken up front from the large load or the new customer. Interconnection construction, so the substation and transmission, 12 to 18 to 24 months. That's likely going to overlap with going out to the market and procuring the power. From there, you're going to be looking at this is dated, I would say probably 48 to 60 months minimum if you started today to go build a power plant. I know I've spoken, with Siemens and GE, and it's 5 years from now to get a combustion turbine if you said go right now. So there's enormous strain and demand to get power supply equipment. So you're talking about, from the time you've got the customer to the time you actually deliver power, is probably going to be a 5 to 6 year process. And so during that time, there's a bunch of cash flow impacts. And when do you need to procure that cash from the customer? Once you're up and running, you're going to be buying power in the market. You then translate that into a bill. It takes another month to get that customer to pay that bill. You're now seeing things like, we want the large loads to pay every 2 weeks. They maybe pay weekly. So that cash flow issue of when the utility is incurring costs versus when they recover it from the customers being shrunk. So the longer time you have, the more cash flow and cash reserves you need. The shorter period of time, the less the cash flow needs are, the less the cash reserve needs are. So this is a very, very quick touch on some of these issues around growth and how the infrastructure and power supply is impacted by these customers. But this is just some of the elements you need to consider. And then the timing of this process, it just keeps expanding and becoming longer and longer. Really around the power supply side, there's just such a strain on capacity. And with that, there we go. Yeah, I think that wraps us up, but I think there's one last disclaimer slide on here, just in regards to the presentation today. And then Jeff, I think you posted in here, which is an excellent site, the SEPA site, as far as tracking those large load tariffs. That's a great site, and one we've referenced as well. Again, if you go look into those large loads, there's a lot of convergence around the terms. Like I said, typically 12 to 15 years is, I would say, was where almost all of these contracts are moving. They're almost all structured as unique to the customer, and the capacity costs are going to be assigned to them. That's a pretty common structure for those. But I would really recommend, if you wanted to learn more about the large load tariffs, that's a great place to go.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Tony. That was very interesting and informative. And as we can tell, I think just scratching the surface. And so we are over time. And so we're gonna bring this to a close at this point. But I do want to make sure to invite everyone. Of course, these slides will be posted on the landing page for this webinar series. Please, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to get in touch with Lisa. With me, I am not listed on the slides, but I'm going to drop my email. It's in the chat right now if you want to follow up on anything, or I assume also with Tony, who can really answer your questions if you have lots of nitty-gritty detailed questions. And so I want to thank everyone for their attendance today and for sticking with the presentation. And we will be around next month with the next in the series. And again, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us after the fact if you'd like to discuss something and follow up. So, all right, thank you to everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.